Hebrews chapter 11. We're going to read beginning with verse 23. Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 23. By faith, Moses, when he was born, was hid 3 months of his parents because they saw he was a proper child and they were not afraid of the king's commandment. By faith, Moses, when he was come to years, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he had respect unto the recompense of the reward. By faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. May God add his blessing to his word. Among all the men and women who are mentioned in the Bible, the life of Moses is one that rises up as one of the mountain peaks in the whole range of characters who are given place in the narrative of Scripture. Moses is a man who had a very distinct mission from God, and the scene of his call from God was a very dramatic moment, a burning bush. The voice of God calling him to take off his sandals because he was standing on holy ground. There was a call to lead the people of Israel out of Egyptian bondage. And we remember Moses as a courageous leader, a man who maintained an intimate relationship with God, a man who stood in the balance between God and Israel. And in the final analysis, Moses was a towering figure among his people. He carried out the mission that God had given him. But many years before God ever spoke to Moses out of the burning bush, long before God gave him this weighty responsibility, when Moses was a much younger man, he had made some very definite, very intentional decisions in his life that set the direction of his future. And the decisions that Moses made way back as a younger man paved the way for him to be able to participate in the plan that God had for his life. And we're given just a little window to look in on the early years of Moses' life, the early decisions that he made. And one of the things that strikes me as I look at what the writer of Hebrews tells us about Moses is how easily his life could have taken a much different direction if he had not made the right decisions as a young man. It was entirely possible that, on the one hand, God could have redeemed the situation and given him another chance, but it's very likely that his life would have ended somewhere very differently than it did if he had made different decisions as a young man. And if he had made less wise decisions, rather than being honored and revered as one of the great heroes of the faith, he would have been forgotten and buried in the Egyptian sands along with all the other notables of his day. But the whole reason we're even talking about Moses thousands of years after he lived is because Moses made some very wise decisions at a pivotal moment in his life. If you have your Bible open, I want you to notice 3 words in this passage, and these 3 words will help provide a framework for us to look at this part of Moses' life. The first word is found in verse 23. It's the word, verse 24. It's the word refused. He refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. And then the second word is found in the first part of verse 26, the word reproach. He esteemed the reproach of Christ. And then the third word is found in the second half of verse 26, and that is the word reward. Refuse, reproach, and reward. And I'm not a slave to alliteration, but it is kind of a nice little gift when the 3 little words right in the passage all happen to start with the letter R. And so that's going to provide the framework for our outline. But we can't even begin to approach the subject of Moses' faith without considering the faith of his parents. You know the story well. At the time when Moses was born, the Israelites have been slaves. They have been serving the Egyptian Pharaoh, expanding, improving his kingdom. They've been in Egypt for several hundred years. And because of the Israelite population, it's growing at a rate that is alarming to the Pharaoh. He's concerned if these people were to join the enemies of Egypt, they might overpower the people. And so he issues an order to the Hebrew midwives. Every little Hebrew baby boy that's born is to be killed. And those Hebrew midwives courageously find ways to defy the Pharaoh's wicked edict. God blesses them because of it. But it's during this time that a couple from the tribe of Levi, Amram and Jochebed, those are not names we find in the top 100 baby names in 2026. But Amram and Jochebed have a little baby boy. And here in Hebrews 11, verse 23, the Bible says the little boy was a proper child. When the story is recorded in Exodus, the writer said Jochebed looked at the child and he was a goodly child. Other renderings of these verses say that Jochebed saw her little boy and that he was a fine child or a beautiful child. Now, why in the world does the Bible include that detail? He's a fine child, a beautiful child. Everybody thinks their newborn baby is beautiful. I have never seen a mother post a picture of her newborn on Facebook and say, this is little Johnny, he was born just this morning. He's as ugly as mud and cross-eyed as a mosquito, but we sure do love him. No, everybody says, whether it's true or not, everybody says, isn't that the most precious baby you've ever seen? Newborns, let's just be honest, newborns usually aren't that cute. But I digress. It doesn't matter if a little baby has a face only a mother could love. Everybody says, oh, what a cute, beautiful baby. Very common to say that a baby is beautiful. Why this detail? Well, over in Acts chapter 7, just before Stephen, the first Christian martyr, was stoned to death, he gave the people a history lesson on God's dealing with the people of Israel. And when he talked about Moses, he said that when Moses was born, he was exceeding fair. Interestingly, another translation expands on that and says he was beautiful in God's sight. One scholar that I was reading after suggested that when the Scripture describes Moses as being beautiful in God's sight, it isn't just that Amram and Jochebed said, what a handsome baby boy God has given us, but somehow there was something about Moses that marked him, and they understood as they looked at him, this little baby has come into this world for a specific purpose. God has a plan for this baby. They might not have known specific details, but there was something about him, some indication. This little boy that had come into the world had a divine destiny. Now, legally, they weren't supposed to have this baby. But because they had chosen to obey God and trust Him, they defied Pharaoh's edict, and the baby was born, and by faith they put their precious baby in a basket and put that basket in the waters, the crocodile-infested waters of the Nile River. Now, we're so familiar with that part of the story, we kind of just blaze right past it, but that was not an easy thing to do. There's something in a mother and a father that wants to protect our children, but in a very tangible way. Amram and Jochebed take their little baby, and they're putting him in God's hands. I want to pause just a minute to speak to our parents, and I'm talking to myself. We need to remind ourselves sometimes, you can trust God with your kids and with their lives and with the future. We look at the world and there are things that bother us and burden us and concern us, but God has a plan for your children and my children, and God's plans are always best. And Amram and Jochebed had to trust God's plan enough to put their little baby in the Nile River. Really, they're putting him in God's hands. And it didn't take long for them to begin to see God's faithfulness in the life of their son. It's an incredible story. Of all the people who could have discovered this little baby in an ark of bulrushes, it's one of Pharaoh's own daughters. You couldn't make this story up. God's plan is full of surprises, and Pharaoh's daughter sees this beautiful little Hebrew baby boy, and he pulls on her heartstrings, and she wants to keep him. This isn't, Daddy, I found a puppy, can we keep him? This is, Daddy, I found a baby, can we keep him? But she needs somebody to take care of him. And Moses' sister Miriam just happens to be watching from a distance, and she makes herself known, and she happens to know just the person who can take care of this baby. And can you imagine the delight in Jochebed's heart when her little baby that she had placed in God's hands not long before is laid back in her arms? And it's very clear she's going to get to raise her little boy after all. Now, we don't know exactly how long Moses lived with his Hebrew family. I think we typically assume that he was taken to Pharaoh's daughter maybe as a toddler, a little while after he was weaned. It could have actually been much longer. Exodus chapter 2 simply says the child grew and then was taken to Pharaoh's daughter. And it's reasonable to think that Jochebed would have tried to hold on to him as long as possible. And this was all a part of God's plan for Moses' life. It wouldn't be long until Amram and Jochebed would be sending their son right into the mouths of the lions, so to speak, to be influenced, to be educated by the pagan Egyptians. And yet, God allowed Moses' parents this window of time to speak into his life, to train him in some of his most formative years. And while Amram and Jochebed had his ear while he was in their home, there's no doubt that they instructed their son and they told him everything they knew about the history of his people. He would have known about God's covenant with Abraham. They would have told him about Isaac and Jacob and Joseph and the challenges that he faced and God's faithfulness. Maybe one day Amram took little Moses to see Joseph's bones, and he said, now before Joseph died, he believed that one day we would be set free from Egypt, and he made his family promise whenever that time comes, they're going to take his bones out of the promised land. And one day, Moses, that's going to happen, and Joseph's bones are going to go. Amram and Jochebed believed the promises that God had given their fathers. Moses' parents lived by faith, and they did their best to pass that faith on to young Moses, so that by the time Moses moved in with Pharaoh's family, there were seeds that had been planted in his mind that would remain forever. And so the day comes that Jochebed sends her little boy to live with Pharaoh's daughter, and Pharaoh's daughter makes him and takes him as her son and names him Moses. And now Moses is a member of the most prestigious family in all of Egypt. And for the next number of years, possibly as many as 30 years, Moses receives the best education available. He's immersed in the teachings of Egyptian idolatry. He's introduced to the most highly developed Egyptian knowledge of that day, probably educated, trained for some position of political leadership. It's interesting, God was using the pagans to train his own man to accomplish his own purpose years later. Doesn't God have some amazing ways of working things out? And Moses enjoys in this time, he enjoys the decadence of living the life of royalty. He could have indulged in every sensual pleasure that was available. All of the things of the world were available at his fingertips. From a purely worldly perspective, Moses had it made. He might not have been born with a spoon in his mouth, but when he went to Pharaoh's palace, he had life handed to him on a silver platter. Kind of makes me think about the man who was being honored as his city's leading citizen, and when he was called upon to tell the story of his success, he said, "Friends and neighbors, when I first came here 30 years ago, I walked into town on a muddy dirt road with only the suit on my back, the shoes on my feet. And he said, all my earthly possessions were wrapped up in a little red bandana tied on the back of a stick that I carried over my shoulder. That's all I had when I came into town." But he said, now I'm the chairman of the board of the bank. I own hotels and apartment buildings and office buildings and 3 companies with branches in 49 cities. Friends, your city has been good to me. And after the banquet, a boy approached this successful man. He said, "Sir, could you tell me, what did you have wrapped in that red bandana tied on the stick on your shoulder?" The man said, "Well, son, I had about $1 million in cash and $2 million in government bonds." He had an advantage. Moses had it all handed to him. He was successful. But in the middle of everything that Egypt had given Moses, Moses had something else. I can't help but think that sometimes when the palace was quiet at night and Moses was trying to go to sleep, that his mind would take him back to the simple Hebrew family of his childhood and the words of his parents, the values and lessons that Amram and Jochebed tried to instill in his heart must have played over and over in his mind. He remembered where he had come from. He remembered his family. I don't know how much time Amram and Jochebed were allowed to spend with Moses after he went to live with Pharaoh's daughter, but even if they never saw each other again, I have little doubt that God would slip right into the palace and talk to Moses and bring to his mind things his parents had taught him, and that God opened Moses' eyes to understand some important spiritual truths. And for Moses, the stark contrast between the way his Hebrew parents had trained him and the way of life among the pagan royal family in Egypt, the stark contrast became very clear. And as Moses came of age, he reached a very critical juncture, a pivotal time in his life. And whatever he would decide to do at that moment in time, whatever set of values, whatever life priorities, whatever worldview he would choose, that would determine the direction of his future. On one hand, Moses could choose everything the world had to offer: riches and pleasure and comfort and ease, prosperity. It was all there. He didn't even have to reach for it. It already belonged to him. Or on the other hand, he could embrace a people, an identity, a way of life that on the surface was marked by poverty and suffering and tyranny, but that beyond was a hope of gaining a reward that they couldn't see at present. And so he has this choice. Do I embrace the pleasures and the treasures of Egypt? Or do I embrace the values and the principles and the unseen eternal reward of my parents and my people down in Goshen? And for one of Moses' Egyptian buddies who didn't have the faithful training of Hebrew parents, he would have looked at Moses' life and said, "Man, you got it made. You are so lucky. You have it all." For somebody who had no knowledge of God, no knowledge of the truth of God, doesn't trust God, that decision would have been a no-brainer. Moses, why do you even need to think about this? You're living your best life now. Of course this is where you want to be. You've got what most people would only dream of. You think about the wealth that surrounded Moses in the land of Egypt. They discovered, I think in the 1920s, the tomb of King Tut. And in King Tut's day, they probably weren't even as prosperous in Egypt as they were in Moses' day. But when they found King Tut's tomb, in his burial chamber are golden beds and gold-covered chariots and a throne encrusted with gold and silver. All of these things, wealth and prosperity, compared to the humble existence of the people down in Goshen. The contrast is very, very clear. And Moses stands at a crossroads. And the decision that Moses made, that he had to make at that crossroads, really isn't all that different from the decision that all of us have to make. Maybe you don't have the same level of wealth or affluence that Moses enjoyed, but we live in a world where the very things that Moses had in Egypt are all around us. And conventional wisdom says this is where it's at. This is what life is about. And in some form or another, the pleasures and riches of this life scream for our attention and our allegiance. In John chapter 2, John used 3 phrases to encapsulate the spirit of this present age. He said, all that's in the world is the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. I heard someone define those phrases by saying this: the lust of the flesh says, what I feel I do. And the ultimate truth is how I feel, and I'll do what I feel like doing because I want to. The lust of the eyes says, what I see, I want, and if I want it, I get it, or at least I spend my life trying to get it. And the pride of life says, what I have, what I own, I worship. I am what my desires have made me. And so after you spend a lifetime fulfilling the lust of the flesh and the lust of the eyes, you look back and you step back and you look at it all and you're proud of what you have and who you are and what you've accomplished. And then you die and it's all passed on to someone else. The lust of the flesh and the lust of the eyes and the pride of life can express themselves in 1,000 different ways. But at the end of the day, it's all focused on me. The spirit of Egypt is very much alive in 2026. I'll never forget the summer after my freshman year at God's Bible School. Our family was in Colorado Springs, and we visited the Air Force Academy there. And if you ever go, you need to see the chapel on the Air Force Academy. Beautiful architecture. On the outside, it's constructed to look like airplane wings that are crisscrossing. On the inside, a beautiful stained glass window, and up on the balcony, a large pipe organ. And it just so happened, the day we were visiting there, somebody was getting ready to play the pipe organ. And I was standing with my dad down on ground level. We were looking up towards the balcony, and another man was standing nearby. He turned to my dad and he pointed up the balcony. He said, "That's my son. He's getting ready to play the organ, the pipe organ." He said, "It's always been a dream of his to play the pipe organ here in the Air Force Academy chapel. They've given him permission." And then he said something like this. He said, "When my son was young, he really felt like God wanted him to be involved in music ministry in a church. And he wanted to do that. But then he found out there wasn't any money in music ministry. And so he went into medicine, and he's a doctor, and that's more lucrative and just made a lot more sense financially." And he chuckled like we would all understand that. Let me be the first to say we need Christians who will enter the medical field. We need Christians everywhere to saturate the world with the gospel at all levels. I believe that. But that man's comments were ironic that day for a couple reasons. One thing, he didn't realize he was talking to my dad, who has actually spent his entire life sacrificially in music ministry. But secondly, when his son began to play the pipe organ, the song of all songs he could have chosen was, "I'd rather have Jesus than silver and gold. I'd rather have him than riches untold." I understand I don't know all the ins and outs of that man's life. I don't stand here as his judge. But I've never been able to forget what his dad said that day. It's easy, it's far too common for people to count the cost of obedience to Jesus, to count the cost of making decisions that run cross-grain to the wisdom of the world, to count the cost of what it will take to stand against the pressures of our culture and to say, "This is going to cost me too much. This won't pay off down here. It just isn't worth it." Every once in a while, I'll pull out one of my yearbooks from Bible college days. It doesn't really feel all that far removed. For the longest time, Jennifer and I felt like we had just graduated from Bible college, and then I think it was back in 2018, we had Jameson Plank for a ministerial intern, and one day he looked at Jennifer and me and he said, "You do realize how much older you are than me, don't you?" So rude. But every great once in a while, I'll pull out an old yearbook and flip through and look at pictures, and it brings back memories. But I look at all the faces, and I'm thankful there are so many of them who are serving the Lord. They're in ministry. They're doing what they were preparing to do. Ryan Mills and I were in college together. We've got a few stories. But among the faces of those who are still serving God and doing now what they felt called of God to do years ago, there are so many faces of people who, when they were faced with some of the same decisions as Moses, will I embrace the way of faith, or will I embrace the spirit of Egypt? They looked towards Egypt and fell in love with the pleasures of Egypt, and their decision to embrace the material and the earthly and the temporary has derailed them. And either they have made shipwreck of their lives, or else they're coasting along, assimilating with culture, aiming for nothing of eternal value, no investment, no concern for the life to come. It's always so sad when you think of what could have been. And for many, they didn't just step right into the situation they're in tonight, but it was a gradual series of choices as they embraced the earthly and the temporal over the eternal. But Moses reached this pivotal moment of decision. Would he hold on to the fleeting temporary pleasures of Egypt, or would he embrace the God of Israel and spend his life pursuing true reward? What was his decision? Look at verse 24. By faith, Moses refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. This was a very definite, intentional decision to deny fleshly desire. Verse 24, Moses refused. Verse 26, Moses esteemed the reproach of Christ. One of the meanings of that word esteemed is the idea of an intellectual process, meaning Moses didn't make a careless decision here. He carefully weighed out the situation. He looked at what Egypt had to offer versus what God had to offer. He thought about it. He came to a conclusion. And verse 27, we read, he forsook Egypt. It's a very deliberate choice that's communicated here. One writer called it a heart renunciation. This is not, I think I may, I think I might follow God. This is, I have settled the question forever. This is, every bridge is burned behind me. This is, I will choose the holy joys that always last and reject sin's pleasures that will soon be past. To the treasures of true worth I'm holding fast. One of the reasons so many have failed spiritually is because in their heart they have tried to live in the family of Pharaoh and the family of God at the same time, and it just doesn't work. You can't live on the fence. You can't serve two masters. It's not my plans and my goals and my desired future and a little helping of God on the side, please. No. It's choose you this day whom you will serve. That's the kind of decision Moses made. And I want you to see that Moses' decision was not just a refusal of what Egypt had to offer, it was an exchange. He refused Egypt, but he embraced the reproach of Christ. Verse 27, we read Moses didn't fear the wrath of the king. I think that anger was not so much because Moses killed the Egyptian taskmaster. I think maybe it's very possible Pharaoh was angry at Moses because he had rejected the prestige of Egypt for the shame of Goshen. Can you imagine how embarrassing that had to be for Pharaoh? Somebody in his own household would reject everything he'd offered him and go join up with the slaves. This is opposed to conventional wisdom. Why would Moses trade the riches of Egypt for the reproach of Christ? Why would a bright young person give their lives for the cause of the gospel of Jesus Christ? This is the same paradox that Jesus presented to his disciples. He said, if any man will come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whosoever will save his life, try to preserve his life, insist on having his own way, he'll lose it. And whosoever will lose his life for my sake shall find it. For what is a man profited if he shall gain the whole world and lose his own soul? There are two more phrases I want to point out to you. Verse 26, Moses had respect under the recompense of the reward. That's a lot of words, but very simply stated, he had his eyes on a heavenly reward, and he endured as seeing him who is invisible. You say, why did Moses trade the treasures of Egypt for the reproach of Christ? Because God graciously allowed Moses to see that the treasures of Egypt were temporary. They weren't going to last. You only enjoy the pleasures of Egypt for so long, and then the fun runs out, and eventually you leave it all behind. And God enabled Moses to see that. And God gave Moses eyes of faith to see that there is a greater reward. There's an eternal reward that awaits those who reject the treasures and pleasures of this world and live for the treasures of the world to come. And so Moses decided he was more than willing to reject the pleasures of sin with all of its emptiness and dissatisfaction so that one day he could dwell in God's presence and find fullness of joy and pleasures evermore. One writer said it's like trading tin for gold. This world is not my home. I'm just a passing through. My treasures are laid up somewhere beyond the blue. That's the song that Moses was singing in his heart. And in this life, we forfeit the all-consuming pursuit of passing pleasure so that we might receive a far greater reward someday in eternity. And if we could talk to Moses tonight, we could bring him up here on the platform, we could say, that moment back there where you had a choice between the pleasures of Egypt and the treasures of Egypt and walking with God's people and looking for the reward that was yet to come, that moment when you made the decision you made to go with God's people, was it worth it? Was it worth it? I think he would say to us, all the treasures of Egypt are gone. They're buried in the sands of time, maybe decaying in a display at a museum. They're not doing anybody any good. But he would say the reward that I persevered to receive, what I gained by forsaking Egypt and embracing Christ, he would say I'm enjoying the presence of God, the unsearchable riches of Christ, and it will go on and on and on and on through the glad eternities. Was it worth it, Moses? Oh, yes, it was more than worth it. If you're going to keep from getting caught up in the rat race and the allure of the stuff of this world, it requires some intentional decisions, setting some definite boundaries in your life until you can say, these are the things that are most important to me because I believe they're most important to God. And anything that would distract me or draw me away from the Lord, I'm going to have to detach myself from that. God wants to be the master of your priorities. I realize this isn't a new or novel message, but it's one of supreme importance. Where is your heart's treasure? If you embrace the temporary pleasure of the here and now while forsaking the things that are eternal, you're building on sinking sand. But if you choose to invest in eternity, you're building on a solid rock, and the dividends are absolutely out of this world. The pleasures of Egypt will pass away, but the treasures of following after God, embracing the reproach of Christ, are eternal. Choose wisely. Choose wisely. Would you stand with me tonight? Brother Larry Shuey, would you dismiss us in prayer?